In 2019, an American institution died with barely a whimper, though maybe a flatulent fart might be a more appropriate sound effect for its death. And when I say American, in fact, this company was Australian. Welcome to my series on the history of comic books, and this is brought to you by Horror, the first time America's Paranoia infected the world. This book covers the international war on comic books in the 1950s by Western governments all over the world, and in many ways it mirrors the international political environment of the last few years. But getting back to our point, what is the most expensive printed ad in the world? Well, for my mind, with $1 million price tag, the most expensive ad is actually connected to the most expensive comic book in the world, Action Comics #1. This was the first appearance of Superman, and has that famous cover of Kryptonite's favourite son lifting a car well over his head while people are either running away in terror or looking on in wonder. But did you know there's an Australian connection to this comic?
Here on Weekend Magazine, we subscribe to the philosophy that human beings are intrinsically funny. However, your would-be professional prankster would never be caught dead without his or her favorite bag of tricks. Gotcha! The squirting flower, a classic humor gag, and just one of many products manufactured by a group known as the Johnson Smith Company. Never heard of them? Well, let me tell you a story.
The front cover of Action Comics #1 is one of the most iconic images from the 20th century, but how many of you seen what's on the back cover? Now, you may never have heard of the Chicago-based Johnson Smith Company, but I'm positive you know their products. And from here on, I will be saying JSC instead of Johnson Smith Company, because that's going to get very boring very quickly. Have you ever had a whoopee cushion? Did you buy your own live chameleon through the mail? Did you ever learn to throw your voice or hypnotize your friends? Did you own an X-ray machine? Anyone who read comics up until the 1990s know very well the full-page ads that used to dominate these comic pages. Some of the most bizarre and tacky items ever offered were on these pages of old comic books. And growing up in Canberra in Australia, I recall spending enormous amounts of time poring through these ads, looking for some miraculous item that I could buy. And yet somehow I always understood it was impossible for me to order these things because I lived across the Pacific and these things were just not going to get mailed to me. In fact, it's the inaccessibility of these items that made these ads seem more than maybe otherworldly, like I was looking at the treasure of some distant country, perhaps highlighted in National Geographic. A country that I could never visit, and certainly items that I could never own. I also don't recall thinking that these items were too good to be true. They just seemed miraculous. Fish-flavoured candy, remote control flying ghosts, build your own submarine. Sure, these were little novelties designed to separate kids from their money, but I do recall thinking that American kids were so lucky that they had access to all these wonderful things. And it wasn't just those ads either. We had Hostess fruit pies, Twinkies, all these amazing cereals that were advertised in the comics. Cereals that never reached Australian shores, so it was always a wonder, a world of impossibility, seeing all these amazing things. Slim Jims with werewolves eating them, and I just knew that I could never have them. And in fact, I do recall my first visit to America. In fact, even before that, I had a friend visit America and I asked him to buy me some things, and he came back with Hostess fruit pies and all these remarkable little candies and lollies that I'd always read about as a kid. And I gotta say, they were terrible. I was gutted when I ate these things and realized, oh, they're just awful. But it was a dream come true. In fact, I do recall 3 of my comic collecting friends, we all went to the first screening of Spider-Man, and we all sat there and with a flourish, I actually pulled out 3 Musketeer bars. And we sat there eating these 3 Musketeer bars, the first we'd all ever had, this American candy that we'd been seeing in the ads for so long. And we sat there watching our iconic movie, eating our iconic candy, and it's a memory to cherish. So what was the JSC? Well, it was actually started by Alfred Johnson Smith. And now this was an English-born entrepreneur who grew up in Queensland, Australia. In 1905, he began selling cheap novelty items, and he was finding them wherever he could and selling them for as much as he could and as quickly as he could. And in my research, one of the strangest things I discovered was all these practical jokes and wacky items that Smith was selling were coming from a country, let's just say, not exactly renowned for its sense of humour. They were all built in Germany. These items proved quite popular. They were cheap, they were fun, they were novel. Nobody had ever seen things like this, and business went so well that Smith eventually had to expand and move his company to Sydney, which is the biggest city in Australia. Now, there is one thing that you have to understand with Smith. This guy was on the ball. He was always looking for a niche to exploit. And let's say you watch an old black and white movie. One of the most remarkable things I discovered, and this was by researching the Australian newspapers, Smith had discovered that having a mail order business, he required to take a lot of phone sales, and his phone line was very important. But if you watch any old film, back then you would see that when you needed to make a phone call, you picked up the receiver and you contacted a phone operator, usually some young, pretty woman who would then go, "Yes, sir, I'll connect you right away," and then take a plug it into the pegboard in front of her and connect your phone call. So as you can imagine, if there are 10 operators and they have 20 calls, they're obviously not answering every call. And Smith discovered that he was losing sales, that a lot of people were not getting through to him simply because of the inaccessibility thanks to the phone operator. So one of the first things he designed and started selling were these amazing little cards. They were basically a "I'm sorry I missed you" card. These could be bought in bulk by people who make a lot of these phone calls, so that they could send a card to this person that they had not been able to contact saying, "Look, I did try to call you, but I had not been successful." And when you think some of these places are banks, people that you owe money to, debtors, this is an important point, that it wasn't just that you were ignoring them or that you weren't contacting them, that you had tried. And here was a card in the mail showing that they had tried, and please contact me at your earliest convenience. So it clearly wasn't just novelties that he was selling, he was selling practical items. But let's face it, what JSE is thoroughly renowned for is its novelties. Well, before 1914, it was clear there was a world war on the horizon. And Smith, his company continued to grow so well, he realized that he needed to move his operation once again. And this time he moved to Chicago. Now, Chicago at the time was a transport hub. There was railway lines and roads traveling all across the country. So this was the perfect place to crack the big time. And by moving to America, his market increased enormously. Before the First World War, Australia's population was around 4 million, where America's population was around 150 to 200 million. So using his model to sell through the mail gave him a great chance of enormous success. And here, of course, he continued with the novelties. Simple practical jokes, small toys. These could be made for pennies and could later be purchased by kids with pocket money and adults with access to his growing catalogue of just wondrous things. In Australia, however, it looks like his company kept going. There's not a lot of information I can discover, although in the papers you can see that the A.J. Smith and Company continued to sell and change its inventory from practical jokes to books to things like dresses. Yet it was in Chicago where JSC really made its mark. Now, his physical catalogue was called The Things You Never Knew Existed, and this grew and grew. And it just didn't contain practical jokes and magical tricks. It also carried things like the world's smallest camera and various other pieces and kit that any upcoming spy would need. To give you an idea how successful and how quickly his business grew, in 1929, his catalogue was 768 pages. That's not 768 items. This was pages of items that were being sold. This business was booming. He was making money like you would not believe. In fact, the catalogue became so famous that just recently they reprinted the 1979 catalogue just as a novelty item for your bookshelf, so you could read through all the wondrous things that were being sold. Now, the catalogue must have been a big thing in America, but in Australia, in the rest of the world, in England, it's through the comics that we discovered the JSE company, and this is where it became legendary. Kids all over the world, they were reading their favourite comic books for years, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, even into the 90s. And in these comic books were always ads. You could buy a plastic army numbering in the thousands. You could buy cowboys and Indian sets. You could buy all these amazing things. And many of them were standard. There were always the X-ray specs, things like that. But the company, as we've seen, it kept its finger on the pulse. It always looking for new markets to exploit. For example, in the 70s, when martial arts movies became the hottest things, suddenly out came JSC with their catalogues, with their books on how to kung fu stuff and make yourself into one of the world's most deadliest weapons. And clearly, the model was working. In fact, it was so good that soon JSC had imitators and competitors. And one of these grew so popular, I would argue they were actually more famous than JSC. Now, what kid did not pick up a comic book, especially in the 70s, maybe the 60s, and open up the page and see a family of humanoid pink aquatic creatures swimming about their tiny castle inside a large fishbowl? Yes, of course, we're talking about sea monkeys. Now, these were actually brine shrimp, a water creature that could lay eggs, and those eggs can dry out, especially to survive things like droughts. And they would lay dormant in the ground for as long as needed until the rains recame. They would then rehydrate and start to hatch. Well, of course, this made them perfect for sending them through the mail. And it turns out, the moon. Are you aware that NASA sent Apollo 16 to the moon with many creatures, including sea monkeys? And they placed these on the outside of the capsule to see what cosmic radiation would do to these inert eggs. Do I need to point it out? There are literally dozens of comic books telling us how bad an idea this is, to send creatures out and have them bombarded by cosmic radiation. And these comic stories prophesized exactly what was going to happen to these space monkeys. When they returned, NASA completed the experiment and tried to hatch the space monkeys. 90% of them died, and the few that did actually hatch suffered from severe physical deformations. Yes, NASA had actually created the Fantastic Four, but it did not end out the way that the Fantastic Four did. There was no superpowers, there was just tumours and missing limbs and physical mutations. Throughout the decades, JSC continued to grow. And you think that with the Depression, with the First World War, with the Second World War, that these sorts of companies would be the first ones to suffer because people just did not have time for such fun. But it looks like the exact opposite is true. It's in the darkest times that people look to companies like JSC to find novelties, to find a little bit of light in the dark. And JSC continued to grow and continued to expand. It eventually had to leave Chicago because it got so large, although I'm starting to think they got run out of Chicago. They ended up in Detroit, they ended up in a number of places, and then finally ended up down in Florida. Now it's important to note that it wasn't all plain sailing for the company. In 1938, the Evening Star reported that the company was in trouble with the Federal Trade Commission for misleading advertising in the sale of a book dealing with Cleopatra's beauty secrets. The FTC felt that the book on Cleopatra's beauty secrets will not, as advertised, enable a woman to acquire beauty and will not cause her to be sieged by suitors half mad with admiration for her charms. In 1942, they were in trouble again, this time for selling fake watches. Apparently, train watches or carriage watches were a big thing where there would actually be an image of a train, and these were very finely made watches. Clearly, JSC could see that putting the image of a train on a cheap watch was not that hard to do, and they soon flooded the market with cheaply made, poorly designed, poorly drawn train watches, and got in serious trouble for it. Now, so far these things have been fun. We've been talking about novelties, but going through some of the later catalogues, things were getting darker. The world was getting darker. People were looking for more from their novelty catalogue, and you can see that they started to sell some serious weapons through the mail. Things like knuckle dusters, knives, and even real .22 caliber pistols. Sometimes all of those in the same item. Now these must be some of the most dangerous things that you can send through the mail, especially to kids. But JSC wasn't finished yet. They even started to sell samples of uranium. Now that's just the item every kid wants under the Christmas tree, which is now mysteriously glowing in the dark. Now, it was in my research that as I was flicking through all these ads, I found one that made me really think about a serious issue we have today and whether JSC was culpable for this issue. At first, reading this ad, I was horrified at the simple cruelty of the practice. JSC was sending live animals through the mail. And I'll say that again, live animals through the mail. And it wasn't just simple things like turtles. They were sending monkeys, snakes, all these exotic creatures. And at first when I was looking, it kind of had a chuckle to myself, thinking, well, what was the distribution center like for that place? All these animals in cages, in rows of pens, in buckets, filled to the brim with animals. And workers were just walking along, picking one out of one bucket, putting it into an envelope, sending it out. Humorous and yet incredibly disturbing. The more you think about it, sending live animals through the mail. But this led me to the next problem. I have to wonder how culpable the company was in the invasive species catastrophe that much of the US and other parts of the world are suffering today. All these former exotic pets, things that should never have been in a house, things like Burmese pythons, creatures that would quickly grow, become dangerous, and then their former owners would then release into the wild because they simply couldn't handle them anymore. Lizards, turtles, alligators. JSC happily mailed them all. And I'll remind you, living animals in the mail, all across the country and possibly the world. Now, could this be the source for so much of these infestations, especially in Florida? Florida has enormous problems with invasive species like pythons. Could JSC be the source, or at least one of the sources, for this destruction, for this invasion of exotic species throughout the world? I'm actually starting to think yes. Now, if we go back to my own childhood dreams, well, in the 1970s, a store opened up in my local shopping centre that became my favourite place in the world. It was one of those shoebox-sized stores. It was underneath the elevators, so you can imagine how small this place was. And yet inside, it was a world that I'd been dreaming about my whole life. Fake dog poo, snapping packets of chewing gum. All the tricks and doodads I've been reading about for my whole life were sitting here in the shelves of this tiny place. And I bought every item I could afford. And I never cared that they were worthless, cheaply made pieces of crap. To me, they were a lifetime goal finally achieved. I had younger brothers and sisters, and I now had access to new ways of torturing them. I was in heaven. Okay, I never got to build my own hovercraft or drive a submarine in my backyard, but I did get some of the world's hottest chewing gum to play tricks on all my friends. This was a store that I was hardwired to shop in ever since I read my first comic book. I loved it, and still look back with fond memories on this tiny little place that held all my childhood dreams. As for JSC, the company moved again and again, and I said did eventually end up in Florida. Here they remained for decades, sending ever increasingly sophisticated novelties to pranksters and fools all over the world. And the business itself began to change. Alfred eventually retired, and his kids took over the reins of the company, and things seemed to be going fine. But even the funniest joke in the world will eventually go stale. And with falling sales, and ever-increasing health and safety restrictions on some of the more ridiculous items the company's peddled, the company found itself with diminishing returns for its outlay. And then in my research, I discovered their current website, and at the bottom of it, it carried the following message. After 105 years in business, it is with great sadness that we inform you that the Johnson Smith Company closed our doors on December 31st, 2019. We appreciate your patronage and are sorry we won't be able to serve you in the future. Well, isn't that a sad little headstone for one of these companies that meant so much to us all? Click on any JSC link, you're going to end up on a mail order company's site, and it's a terrible sight, a sad imitation of the insane juggernaut that once was the Johnson & Smith Company. With the closing of JSC, I can't help but think that an icon of our childhood, one that helped create a world where you could buy a submarine, X-ray specs, a live monkey, itchy powders, and a fart alarm, had closed and gone. And I have to admit, on discovering that the business had closed, the world somehow feels a little less magical. Well, I hope you enjoyed this quick look at the insane world of comic book ads. And if this is the kind of story that you like, please, I hope you will pick up my book, Horror. It's a fascinating look into the time when most of the world's governments were blaming comic books for the behaviour of the kids. And what resulted from it really does still affect the world today. Anyway, that's it for this article. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk soon.